There's a famous line in Carl Hugness's book about the Bettenhausen family, where a reporter is looking at Merle Bettenhausen. Merle says to him, "You're looking at me and I know why you feel sorry for me, but you don't know why I feel sorry for you." I'm able to live at the intersection of forces that you don't understand, and to do something that the average human being can't do. When you have control over a powerful machine, and you've hit that cushion just right, and you've made that move at the right time to go underneath that flag and take the checkered flag, to have that moment, and you've paid attention to all the forces, that's got to be one of the greatest feelings on the face of the earth. The minute you do that, the next thing you want to do is to do it again, and do it again, and do it again.
Oh, it's Bettenhausen on fire.
There's Gary Bettenhausen along with his brother Merle. Since 1946, the Bettenhausen has made this walk through Gasoline Alley 44 times.
As near as I can tell, the thing about the Bettenhausens is that they willed themselves to be great drivers.
The number 44 slides 1,000 feet, barely missing Tony Bettenhausen. Suddenly, it is a race.
Tony raced at Indy in the 1950s, and the legacy he left his three sons was his unfulfilled dream of winning the race.
Gary, with the 1991 Lola with Buick Power, turning in the fastest lap in qualifying today at 224.843, his four-lap average.
Well, yes, Jack, you said I was the fastest driver in the field. I think I'm just driving the fastest car in the field.
Gary comes along, the Führer, that's what we called him. God, he screamed at me and told me I was an idiot, didn't know anything about racing, and what a moron, you shouldn't own a car. Oh my God, it was wonderful. We just laughed.
He was a funny guy, but he was intense.
I don't know of any drivers that I ever met that wanted to win the Indianapolis Motor Speedway more than the Bettenhausens.
This dirt car accident 4 weeks ago in California left the Indy 500 veteran seriously injured.
I goofed myself up once before. It's, you know, those cards on the wall make it a lot easier.
You don't know how many more years this family can give to this place. Any thoughts now about that?
I have to start counting days again.
Vapor at the right rear of the car, and then suddenly Bettenhausen was into the wall.
The tragedy of the Bettenhausens, God, how much can one family take? And it would be probably a hell of a documentary. It really would.
We had a chance to buy that merry-go-round, and we spent almost 2 years restoring it, and it's got 30 horses on it, and no horse is the same.
No, you got a carousel.
I think it's both.
Carousel
I beg
classier
you.
than
I beg you.
merry-go-round.
Well, it's much classier. My brain was dead. Merle worked for me for 15 years, and he helped us with our advertising, as you know. We were part of forming Bettenhausen Racing and Associates, and I was glad that I got to be a part of that. And he was a great friend and a wonderful person, and we still miss him. I'm Ray Skillman. I'm originally from Owensboro, Kentucky. I moved here the first day of '79, been here ever since, and I've been interested in racing as far back as I can remember. I had lots of heroes back then. Tony Bettenhausen was one of my heroes. Jimmy Bryan was one of my heroes. Bob Swiker, Roger Ward, Johnny Parsons Sr., Sam Hanks. That's the era that I started with. Most of these cars, these midgets, were hand-built by people in garages locally all over the United States.
A lot of these guys were post-World War II guys that had worked in the aircraft factories, and they were so skilled in metal work, and it's just amazing what they could. All these cars are metal. I mean, they're not like today where everything comes out of a mold, so to speak.
It was made in different sections.
They would section it, cut it, and hit it with a hammer and weld a piece in and
draw file it.
Bill Vukovich, Johnny Parsons, all these great names, Tony Bettenhausen, they all came out of midget racing.
75 to 100 yards as they flash past the start-finish line again.
Tony Bettenhausen, him and Jimmy Bryan were the two winningest IndyCar drivers of the 1950s. Tony Bettenhausen dominated the 1951 season. Tony won 8 of 11 races in IndyCars that year, mostly on dirt. And Gary and Merle and Tony, his sons, carried on the tradition.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
Qualifications drew 100,000 fans. The race, 200,000. 433 acres of people to watch men and machines race 500 miles. Tony Bettenhausen, 42-year-old national champion, has won more races in big cars than any of the others, but not at Indianapolis. This is his
My dad was larger than life at the racetrack, but at home he was just a dad, and we lived by Dad's rules and nobody else's. My dad's name is Melvin Eugene Bettenhausen. That's his Christian name. He was kind of wild when he was young. He used to get a lot of fights, and his hero was Gene Tunney, the boxer.
Tunney lands a perfectly timed right, and Gibbons is down.
So he talked about him, and I don't know if he tried to emulate him or not, but they started nicknaming him, "Hey, Tunney," and then Tunney changed to Tony. He started racing in midgets in 1938, and his saying was, do it right or don't do it at all.
Tony Bettenhausen Sr. was every man's hero. He was the guy that your average common fan could relate to. And he was a master on the dirt miles.
AAA champ in 1951, USAC national champion in 58. Missing from his resume was an Indianapolis 500 win.
Tony Bettenhausen woke up in the morning talking about how he was going to win the Indianapolis 500 and went to bed at night talking about how he was going to win the Indianapolis 500.
Former national champion Tony Bettenhausen knows what it means to take the wheel here on the bricks. Tony, in a qualifying run 3 years ago, he was on his way to break the record in number 99 and ran into real trouble.
Lots of mechanical problems. He was kind of jinxed here at the Speedway.
Another car, another year. Out of the north turn, into the home stretch, tail first.
He finished 3 times, and his 3 finishes were second, fourth, and fourth.
And another 500, this time with the temperature breaking records. Heat exhaustion forced him out of the race.
He loved racing on dirt more than they did pavement, and jokingly back in the 50s, he said, "I wish they'd dig it up and make it dirt." then I'd show him how to get around there.
The marching rhythms of the band beat out the last few minutes of a year of waiting for the drivers. For Al Keller, 38 years old, 4th year at Indianapolis. For Paul Russo, 44 and a grandfather, 12th year at the 500. Bettenhausen, 42, 13 years. Here they come. And the race is on.
He won many races at Milwaukee. He won at Indianapolis here at the fairgrounds. I never won the big one, but probably the biggest day, the biggest, happiest memory was in 1958. That was the first year he led the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Bettenhausen has hauled up on Bryan, and entering the 4th turn, he stands on it and charges into first place.
My dad came down the front straightaway and was leading the race, and we sat in Tower Terrace, my mom and us kids. And when my dad came by leading the race, my mom started crying because, she'd been there since 1946, and this is the first time that my dad ever led the race, and that was pretty cool.
Bettenhausen is pushing the pace to 141 miles per hour.
In 1955, he finished second, but he never led the race. If your whole life has been coming to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and just seeing your dad leading the race and then ended up finishing fourth, I remember that like yesterday. When your dad's racing, everything, the smallest race is the biggest race because they didn't have roll bars back then. Didn't have safety belts back then. Every time you saw your dad get in a race car, might be the last time you saw your dad.
Bryan, Bettenhausen, and Sachs fight it out down the backstretch. Paul Russo brings his number 15 Novi Special into the pits under its own power and reports to his crew what has happened on the third turn.
Paul Russo was his best friend, and they'd been teammates. He was a co-driver with my dad. He spent the winter in 1960 at our house. We were constructing a dryer for drying corn and soybeans, and my dad worked for the Champion Highway Safety Program. He was on the road, and Paul lived with us, kind of like a stepfather taking care of us. But it had nothing to do with Paul. May 12th, 1961. Paul Russo was having trouble getting his car going, so he asked my dad to drive it, and they did that back in the day, where a guy jump in another guy's car and help him. And the fourth lap coming down the front straightaway, bolt fell out of the suspension.
Valerie Bettenhausen gets the call from the racetrack about Tony's accident in 1961. And somebody called and said, it's bad. And she said something like, all the way. And they said, all the way.
He called me at noon, and how he had some brake shoes being worked on for one of the tractors or the combine or something, and he asked me to call and see if they were ready. That was noon, and 10 minutes after 2, Jack Beckley called me, and he was gone.
Everybody says, the big question, your dad died driving a race car, and then you got in a race car and drove it? And I say, everything in our life, everything that had value, we look around, that came from racing. So our whole life was racing and what it produced. And the man that racing produced, which was my dad, his personality, the way he was as a father, everything was driven off the success he had driving. And that related into who he was as a man.
Bettenhausen has hauled up on Bryan, and entering the fourth turn, he stands on it and charges into first place.
My dad died 60 years ago on the 12th of May. He wasn't an educated man, but to think that his name is being mentioned daily in racing, and I bet he's up in heaven looking down saying, you know what? I think I raised a few good kids. They've kept me alive for 60 years because they're still talking about me. So I must have did it right when I raised him.
There's a train coming down the track, coming to carry me home. Hear the sun blow, 100 miles, 100 miles.
After my dad's funeral, And we were farming 500 acres at that time, and it had been a very wet spring, and we hadn't even been out in the field yet. And I remember looking out at all these acres that still had weeds in them and hadn't been planted, and thinking, life goes on. So I grew up pretty quick there. Gary and I did it the first year, and then Gary got married and went off and did some other things and raced go-karts. I stayed at home and did the farming, and then Uncle Sam was after me. This is 64, 65. Vietnam was just starting up, and if you were 18, Uncle Sam said, "We want you." They told me I had to wait a year to get an OCS and then a 3-year commitment after that, and I'm wanting to race. And it was funny because back then, you had 3 choices. If you were a full-time college student, you didn't get drafted. If you were married with a child, you didn't get drafted. Everybody else got drafted. Gary got married, I told you, young, and had a little boy, so he got out of it. So I'm the only one that served my country. See, Gary started racing in 1963 after a couple years of go-karts, and then I didn't start racing until I was almost 23 years old.
That's right. I've got Merle Bettenhausen with me, and Merle is about to run in his first championship car race.
My dad had a saying, experience is best teacher, and since this is my first time in an actual competition in a big car, I'll just go out there and try and get all 100 miles under my belt. Maybe next time or the time after really start to get racy in one of these.
Merle Bettenhausen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I raced in New Zealand and Australia, and this is a picture of me in 1970 at Auckland, New Zealand, racing there, and then I went to Sydney, Australia, actually racing in Terre Haute, and this is winning a race in Auckland, New Zealand, and there I am as a young man.
By any standards, these championship cars are the ultimate in racing sophistication. The lightest, fastest, and most powerful machines ever to run on a closed course oval. They're considered by most to be the epitome in open cockpit racing. Today, here at Michigan International Speedway, this championship division of the United States Auto Club is rewriting the record book. Bobby Unser's Oldsonite Eagle starting up front is the white number 6. Gordon Johncock starts alongside in the Gulf McLaren 24. In the second row, the Sunoco McLaren 7 is driven by Gary Bettenhausen.
The start of my IndyCar career. I actually drove for Grant King at the Speedway. I was teammates with Steve Krisloff. The cars we were driving, this is 1972, were a copy of the McLaren cars that Gary drove for Roger Penske. So I go to Michigan, 26 cars there, I qualified 18th. Everything's fine. The car is at its driving best with about 20 gallons of fuel in it. Now they've put 70 gallons of fuel in the car. So I started the race with basically the car was bottomed out. Turbulence off those wings, and I'd never been in a race before, never been in traffic. My head's buffeted back and forth. Third lap, I got too high coming off the second corner.
Suddenly, it happened. For no apparent reason, Merle Bettenhausen lost it coming out of turn 2 and crashed into the outside rail, bringing out the first caution flag of the day. Jimmy Hurtubise, who was following Bettenhausen, said Merle started fishtailing through the turn, then lunged toward the rail. His right front wheel hit, and the car seemed to explode. He hit the rail so hard, his turbocharger...
I hit the wall. The right front wheel comes back, ruptures the 35 gallons of methanol on the right side. Car catches fire, and I'm fighting the fire, and I'm still wondering, why can't... I had some choice adjectives and different words used here to get out of this SOB. And I turned and looked down and saw my arm was gone. And I yelled, "Oh my God, help me, please."
was taken to the hospital in Ann Arbor to be treated for third-degree burns, and where it was later learned that he lost his right arm due to the accident. Roger Penske withdrew his car from the race, so his driver, Gary Bettenhausen, could accompany his brother to the hospital.
This entire area in my face was skin grafted. The end of my nose fell off, and I was pretty creepy looking. They told me that probably another 45 seconds to a minute, my eyeballs would have melted, or a couple minutes I would have died of loss of blood because of my arm being gone, because it was laying on the racetrack. And so since July 16th, 1972, I've been blessed, man, because I could have easily been blind or easily could have been dead. So every day has been a gift since then.
Second row at 72 Branson, 116 Merle Bettenhausen, and 16 Sam Eisenhower.
The highlight of my life came after I lost my arm when I started racing again. It was 11 months later, I started racing USAC midgets and ran second in the dash, won my heat race. And I'd had some 10th place finishes, 11th, 12th.
Look out, Bettenhausen lost it. The back half of the pack goes wild with cars scattered all over the track.
Each time I was getting more comfortable.
Merle was a good little midget racer, and then he makes a comeback with his hook, and he's a better race driver with one arm than he was with two.
August 31st, we had a race in Johnson City, Tennessee, and the yellow comes out about the 14th or 15th lap, and I'm running fourth, and the power steering hose breaks. So I thought if I had ducks, they'd drown. Race restarts and I get into third place, and I'm driving without power steering now. Then I get into second, the next lap, and Bill Englehart. And I followed him, and I was faster than him. So I waited and waited, and on the last lap, the last corner, I went to the outside, got alongside him and came down, and I beat him by about 6 inches.
He beats Billy Englehart in a midget race in Kentucky on the last lap, which is, I think, one of the great stories in racing. And he knew, you know, I'll never get another chance at Indy, but I can do midgets. After Merle makes his comeback in 73, then Gary gets hurt in 74, so Merle just quits.
I was second in midget standings when I retired in 1974. And if, ands, and buts were candy and nuts, it'd be Christmas every day, but I promise you that I'd have been a midget champion that year.
She has picked him out, and if she can pick on somebody, she will. And she was barking and growling at him. She doesn't mean anything, but she'll nip and pull your clothes. And so I got her. She's tied to a race car. She's just fine. I've swapped places with her. Okay, let's get over here.
And this is the way it was for 40 years or 50 years, and this is a car from the late 40s or early 50s, and you see the tire rack.
But did you drive in any of these cars?
I was the last one to drive the Ford 4Cam #2, and I also was one of the guys that drove the maroon 46 car back in 1970. I drove them both in 1970. So the maroon 46 car was my first. That was a Champ Dirt car. It was my first race, and I ran Springfield, and I finished 9th in it, and it was a different experience from going from a little midget to one of those on a mile dirt track. So yeah, it was quite interesting. And I don't know how much you got into the overhead Ford, the #2 car, but I was the last one to drive it. The engine broke, and they quit racing it after that. So I made that thing go away. But yeah, it's all never drove all. You know, my dad drove all these in Gary, you know, back in the day.
spell your name for us again, please?
Anne, A-N-N-E, Misavage, M-I-S-S-A-V-A-G-E, M.D. I'm the director of the burn unit here at the UC Davis Medical Center.
So, Doctor, what would you say is prognosis?
Well, he's going to end up with some scarring on both wrists from the burns that had to be grafted there. He's going to be probably in too much pain to be able to do any driving for maybe another couple months because of the rib fractures. We've all seen pictures of the disastrous car crashes and fires that can occur, and they're back to their car as soon as they can manage to do it.
This type of thing you're no stranger to, unfortunately, you and your family. So what keeps you going at a moment like this?
I don't know. You know, it's crazy. I guess the lack of success. We've never won the 500, and you just keep trying to do something that you want very badly.
So you're going to come back again? This isn't going to stop you?
I don't think it will.
Here's the thing about the Bettenhausens. Star-crossed, you know, Tony gets killed testing Paul Russo's car because something breaks. And he's got the fastest practice lap, and he's got the best chance ever to win the race. And then Merle loses his arm, gets burned. Gary comes along, couldn't drive a greasy stick up a dog's ass the first 2 years. People are like, this is embarrassing. But he was so determined to make it. So determined to make it. He made himself a race driver.
Gary came down when I was in high school from Tinley Park. He was probably a senior. I was maybe a freshman or sophomore. But he drove his 55 Chevy down, and he had it tricked out. Well, he came down because he knew there was a drive-through teenagers would go to, like in the 50s, 60s, you know, the circle. They call it the pole. We'd go around the pole and slowly visit, say hi to people. So Gary, and that's where he picked up drag races. Some guy in a brand new Grand Prix comes up around the circle in front of the cars, and Gary sends his buddy out, and the guy says, yeah, I'll go race you. And I started him off, and they drag raced off, came back, went back to the pole, and Gary won $20. And he needed every bit of that with that gear ratio to get back to Tinley Park.
There was nobody like Gary. He was probably the closest thing to my dad. They're pretty carbon copies. Nothing was acceptable except winning. His life was a trophy dash. Everything was now.
I think Gary was running the stock cars on dirt before I went to California that summer, 63 or so.
It was some tough first years on the circuit. He just kind of had to build himself into what he ultimately became.
The year was 1968, and Marietta, Ohio's Larry Dixon had won 6 consecutive USAC sprint races. The Gary was second-generation driver Gary Bettenhausen, who was a rookie seeking to end Dixon's streak and win his first race at the Terre Haute, Indiana action track. Dixon could never find the handle and finished 12th in car number 4. The checkered flags flew for Bettenhausen, who won his first of 40 USAC sprint car races. Dixon went on to win the championship that year, but it was the first of 4 consecutive years that Gary and Larry would trade the sprint car title.
In the late 60s, him and Larry Dixon start having this wonderful battle. So the Larry and Gary show became must-see racing.
In the second row, number 2 is Gary Bettenhausen with number 1 Larry Dixon on his side.
Between 1968 and 1971, Gary was second in sprint car points to Larry Dixon. Next year, Gary was first, Dixon was second. Next year, Gary was first, Dixon was second. Next year, Dixon was first.
Dixon seems to be losing a little steam. Bettenhausen is closing on him now in a bid for the second place money.
That time, I didn't want to see somebody younger than me come in and just take over, and I was going to make them work for it regardless of whatever happened.
I'd go to the racetrack every night, didn't matter where it was, and I thought
boy, if I can beat Dixon tonight, I can win it. And it got to the point for 4 years where Larry and I were just racing each other, and it was like nobody else was even there. You know, I knew that if I could beat Larry, I could win it, and I think he felt the same way.
The two of them won, I think, over 50% of the races in the USAC sprint car.
To me, there's always been rivalries, and that just was that generation's. Now, they became very good friends as time went on, but at the time, they were pretty tight rivals, no question about it.
Now they're 3 high out of the 4th pocket with Bettenhausen on the outside. He explodes past Dixon to take the 2nd spot.
One can make the case that the battle between Gary and Larry was a defining, that's where in many ways the term the Thunder and Lightning division was sort of built, because they were so routinely going back and forth. And I forgot what the statistic was. Like over this period, about 3 or 4 years, the percentage of times they both finished in the top 3, it was astronomical.
Larry Dixon and Gary Bettenhausen virtually owned the USAC sprint car division. In fact, during those 4 years, they each won 2 championships. When they didn't win the championship, they finished second to each other. In fact, to win a sprint car feature, you had to beat the Larry and Gary show. And perhaps the best way to get these guys to reminisce is to feed them a beer or two and let them bench race.
We raced probably the first 2 years, and we probably didn't say 20 words to each other. And then it was later on, as we both started to mellow a little bit, that we really got to know each other and appreciate each other.
I'll tell you what, over all the years and all the racing that I've ever done, I can look back and I think all the fun, I can still walk, I can talk about it, my feet work, and I think it's just a hell of a deal that what we did.
We're at the Grant King Race Shop, west side of Indianapolis, halfway between Raceway Park and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. This is a place that Todd and I went to a lot when we were kids. Dad drove for Grant. Well, basically a who's who of race drivers and fabricators during the 1970s and on into the 80s, either worked for or drove for Grant. There's a lot of memories here. Bill Throckmorton, who's Grant's nephew, resurrected this place, turned it into a working museum. They still do fabrication work here, but also it's a
restoration of older race cars.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a place where they do restore older cars, and they've collected quite a bit of memorabilia along the way. Some of it has to do with Dad, and some of it certainly brings back childhood memories. So if you want to take a look. This was Dad's first Silver Crown win, Springfield 1978. That is one of us, I believe. That's probably my brother Todd, but you know, when we wore our Coke bottle glasses when we were kids.
It's like the piston, there's no way to know for sure.
Yeah. We see ourselves in pictures and we try to figure out who's who. One of his Silver Crown trophies from DuQuoin right here. And quite a few pictures on the wall of Dad, you know, back when he was racing for Evel Knievel. Here's one. He hated that suit. Everyone else loved it, but he was not very comfortable wearing the Evel Knievel getup.
Yeah, and I don't know if Carrie mentioned it, but this is a Grant King car. And if you look at that car right over there, that red one, you can see that it's, you know, it's almost identical.
Grant's cars were very distinctive, the shape of the roll cage and the shape of the bodywork.
So he built a lot of winning cars, and there's 2 of them right there.
We could go through this place forever. There's so many pictures, so much memorabilia. We all had the same childhood. I mean, we grew up in infields, going to races every weekend. A lot of Dad's career took place when we were very young. We were probably 5 years old when the Larry and Gary show kicked into high gear. A lot of that stuff happened early enough in my childhood where I probably took it a little bit for granted. You don't think about it that way because, you know, you get up and go to school and eat breakfast and watch TV and all that other stuff, and he's just a normal guy until he gets to the racetrack.
has won 3 times on the 1-mile dirt ovals of the Midwest in the championship dirt car division. A very successful midget racer in his own right, Gary Bettenhausen, car number 96.
You know, racing was serious. It was how our family made a living. Once you were at the racetrack, you didn't dare bring up anything but how we were going to run good that day. You know, they met only 2 or 3 years after our grandfather died, so she knew what it was all about. Mom was all in.
You know, she was always there to support him. You know, she'd sit in the infield in a lawn chair with a paperback book and read unless Dad was racing, and she would keep stats.
She hand wrote the times.
Yep.
You know, we worked on the cars since we were old enough to get started, really, always closely supervised.
Well, I think he was definitely hard on us. We got yelled at a lot, but we deserved it, and we learned from it. I think he only raised his hand once or twice that I can remember as a kid. After that, all he had to do was raise his voice. He had a reputation of being really brash, strict disciplinarian, yelling at people all the time, things like that. But really, I mean, he was very soft-hearted. You know, I do remember times when things were tough financially, and there was discussion of Dad having to go get a real job. You know, it never happened though. He managed to make his living exclusively from auto racing, which didn't happen as much back then as it does now.
The cars are pushed out for the main event. Gary Bettenhausen will start in the 7th row. Mel Kenyon will start in the rear. Foyt is ready to go for it. Tony Holman gives the "Gentlemen, start your engines" command. AJ pushes off.
The Astrodome in 1969. I just remember the place was so incredible, and
it was like one of the 7 wonders of the world back then.
Right. And getting on an airplane and flying down there, when I was 5. I remember rolling mud balls in the grandstand. Remember the sound of that Offie midget.
That's a good one. I have to agree, that's probably the first one that I remember.
When Dad won, running for Bob Nowicki. And he always stuck around for the last autograph, which is something that he got from his dad. I can't tell you how many times they turned the pit lights out, and Mom would be saying, "Come on, Gary, we got to go," and he was still there, making sure that everybody got their autograph or got their picture.
He stayed for every last person.
Yep.
And that's probably the part that makes me prouder of him as a person and as a race driver, was how he was with the fans rather than what he did on the track. He made time for everyone, every single person.
Johnny Rutherford still the leader in the Springfield 100. We're coming to you live, remember. 2nd place, Al Unser. And in 3rd place, number 16, Gary Bettenhausen, in the race that is named after Gary's father, the late Tony Bettenhausen.
He was 2-time champion in sprint cars. He was 2-time champion in Silver Crown cars. And this was before 1974.
He wins a race for Thermo King, I think at Phoenix, and Phil Casey's his mechanic, and it's a good little team. But Roger Penske says, "Come with me, boy."
They're moving to Sunoco, moving to Sunoco.
Here's Roger Penske, golfer, racing driver, automotive expert. He moved to Sunoco for custom blending.
Once I tried custom blending, nothing else was good enough.
Roger's thinking was right. He said, "Look, I got a stock car for you to drive. You don't need to be driving midgets and sprint cars and dirt cars anymore. You're going to bust your ass." Well, he breaks his arm at Toledo in a sprint car and doesn't get fired, but we're all like, "Schmuck?" His nickname was the Schmuck, by the way, which he found endearing, which is great. "Schmuck, don't fuck up this Penske ride. I mean, you can win the 500 5 times."
Mark Donahue is making his 4th attempt at the 500. Marquez is his teammate, Gary Bettenhausen. They all pilot 2 Offie-powered McLarens owned by Roger Penske.
Gentlemen, start your engine.
Gary Bettenhausen, determined to make this his year.
It's a new track record, 47 and 50 seconds, 47.50, one lap speed 189.474.
The first 500 that was won by either Gary or I was going to be for our dad. So that was my dad's win. And then the ones that came after that were going to be for each one of us individually. So it was pretty powerful.
A wheel-to-wheel duel develops between teammates Mark Donahue in number 66 and Gary Bettenhausen in number 7. The leader, Bobby Unser, is slowing through turn 4. He coasts into the pits with a dead engine. With Unser out of the race, Gary Bettenhausen of the Sunoco McLaren takes over the lead. For the race leader, Bettenhausen, a pit stop.
His first year was 68, but in 72, he was driving for Roger Penske. His teammate was Mark Donahue, and he led 138 laps out of 200.
Time in the pits cuts his lead, and Mike Mosley is breathing right down his back. Mike passes Gary and takes the lead. 3 laps later, Mosley loses a wheel in the number 4 turn. He crashes into the outside wall. Teammate Donahue keeps up the pace and keeps Gary well in sight.
He was getting ready to lap Mark Donahue, who was running second.
Gary Bettenhausen has led all but 7 laps since Bobby Unser dropped out. But now, something seems to be wrong. He's going very slowly through the number 3 turn.
The engine had developed a serious problem.
The checkered flag falls for number 66 as Donahue completes his 200th lap.
Penske's first win should have been with Gary driving. He just fell out of the race with 18 laps to go. Nobody deserves to win the Indy 500. You earn the win at the Indy 500. Every little thing has to be right. Everything has to go your way, make no mistakes. Now, Gary deserved the win in 1972, and that was without a doubt. But just being a participant doesn't mean you earn a win.
I remember the 72 Indy 500 as a kid. You know, I was 8. I just remember,
I remember Mark Donahue pulling into victory lane.
Yeah.
But, I tell people that day in 72, okay, he didn't win it this year, he's going to win it next year. That's kind of how I felt about it, just because that's how great I thought he was.
He doesn't, he cried after the race, and everybody cried, and they hugged him and all. But by the next day, he was like, my old man didn't win it. He's a great race driver. I'll get it someday. I mean, he was all ready to go again.
I remember growing up with my dad, and when the race was over, and it used to be always on May 30th when my dad raced, his next thoughts were involved with what he was going to do a year later. So Gary was very similar. I don't know of any drivers that I ever met, family or non-family, that wanted to win the Indianapolis Motor Speedway more than the Bettenhausens.
He grew up as Tony Bettenhausen's son. Great opportunities, but great burden. I mean, and he did struggle. His cars weren't very good, and he struggled.
You've had your problems here a couple of years ago. Weren't you leading it, and then all at once the bottom fell out on you?
Yes, I led it for 71 laps, and a coil wire fell off the engine and put us out, so I hope we can do a little better today.
And there is Gary Bettenhausen, isn't that number 16? And it doesn't look like he knows any more than we do exactly what is wrong with it.
Cannot got a disappointed Gary Bettenhausen with me. Gary, you stopped quickly for an oil leak, I understand, early in the going. What finally put you out?
Well, the same old four-cylinder story. Not enough fuel and trying to run the engine too hard to compete with the 8 cylinders, and we finally just burned a piston.
He made himself into a race driver. Then the stories about after his accident came back said volumes.
And we'll be back with racing activity at Syracuse, New York in just a moment.
Well, then he busts his ass at Syracuse in '74, and he gets fired in his hospital bed. You couldn't blame Penske. Nobody blamed him. We all screamed at Gary.
What type of pressure are you getting to walk away from racing, or at least that form of racing? And what are your thoughts right now about curtailing the sprint cars and the Silver Crown dirt cars with the Gary Bettenhausen racing career?
Well, put it this way, I have been guaranteed by my family, my wife and my sons and my mother, that I would be coming back here to Methodist in the near future if I didn't give up sprint car and dirt car racing.
But it wouldn't be for burns, right?
Right. I think it would be from personal injury from my wife.
When Gary got hurt in Syracuse, it turned out that he stretched out of the car so bad that he had nerve damage in his neck that went to the controlling muscles to have him bend his arm. And so he could never bend his left arm again.
You know, lunchtime, it used to be great. Vukovic was unmerciful because that was his best friend. And Vuki go, "Hey, schmuck, show us your Indy 500 rings." "Oh, that's right. You were too stupid. You got fired by Roger Penske because you wanted to be a dirt racer." Oh my God, it was wonderful. We just laugh. And then Gary comes back with one arm, wins the first race, comes back with, he Velcros his arm to the steering wheel at Fort Wayne. He wins the 100-lapper with his arm Velcroed to the steering wheel because he can't, and it falls off during a yellow once, and he finally gets it back onto the steering wheel, and you know, that just shows you the determination he had.
Single-minded, bullheaded, and tough. And he wanted to be great.
He raced from 1974 to 1993 with his left arm that he couldn't bend. He had to time his pit stops so that when he came in, there was nobody near him because he couldn't turn the car quick enough to get into the pits and park. He never wanted anybody to know how bad his arm was because he kept thinking he could get another great IndyCar ride. He came back and first race out he won.
Good afternoon, everybody. From the action track in Terre Haute, Indiana, Bob Jenkins and Larry Newber here for the Hut 100. It could all come down to this race here this afternoon. There are 4 midget races remaining, 2 in Arizona, 2 in California. This is the last race in the Midwest, and it is a biggie.
It always followed the Hoosier 100. The Hoosier 100 was on Saturday. And the history of the Hoosier 100, at one time it was the second highest paying race in the world. You'd have 40, 50 cars there. So then they'd go over to Terre Haute the next day with the midgets. And the year before this, in '76, Howard Lenny challenged A.J. Foyt, said, "Hey, I got a midget," you know, and Foyt was getting big. He says, "If you think you can fit in the thing, I'll give you a ride tomorrow," in 1975. And Foyt took the challenge and went and set fast time. He hadn't been in a midget in years. I mean, that's what the Hut 100 meant to those guys.
Running in 5th position would be Gary Bettenhausen, and 6th is Mel Kenyon.
I worked at the Bettenhausens, and whenever Gary drove this car for Howard Lenny out of Mendota, Illinois, but Howard they wheeled and dealed, and Bettenhausens bought cars from him. And when we would go to the races, I would go with Gary. And when you went to the track, I mean, we had a tire machine. You'd bust the tires. We sold fuel. Merle Bettenhausen ran the shop.
Tell me what those big drums are there.
The best facilities I have, the best way of hauling fuel is just in a basic 55-gallon drum.
How many tires do you bring to a typical sprint race and hope to sell?
I usually bring between about 60 and 100 and hope to sell anywhere from 10 to 20.
And I mean, you go back in there and Gary'd come in and they'd give you a list. You'd put the fuel in the car, you'd strap the driver in the car. I mean, you whatever it took to get the car on the track to race, you did it. So Gary was a heck of a mechanic. If he saw you doing something he didn't like, he wouldn't be shy about telling you. Even after he hurt his arm, I helped him bend tubing. Dude, he was a fantastic welder. And Gary built the most beautiful headers I've ever seen by himself. I mean, he was very talented.
Can you tell us when you worked on this car and why it's kind of special to you?
Well, Gary won the HUD 100 in 1976 at Terre Haute. It was a 100-lapper, 33 midgets, 11 rows of 3, kind of copied the Speedway. And, you know, Gary won the race driving this car that day, so it was a big thrill to be part of that. And Gary was a traditionalist, and winning the HUD 100 and races like the Hoosier 100, you know, the mile dirt races, this car here is a real piece of history because the Bettenhausen family believe it's the one victory they got in the HUD 100. And it just meant an awful lot to Gary to win that race.
Sunday, May 30th, 1982, the 66th running of the Indianapolis 500. It's time then to meet the people who are inside these cars. Johnny Parsons, son of an Indy winner, makes his 8th appearance here. And Tony Bettenhausen, namesake of a famous father. And Gary Bettenhausen is the elder brother of Tony. It's time now. Time for Mrs. Mary Holman to give the most famous command in American sport. There it is. They're racing at Indianapolis. And it's Mears and Foyt going into the first turn. A.J. Foyt, it appears, going for the lead. He's got the lead.
Force your eyes to look at the crowd and the things that are going by in the background because they are going through these turns at 200 miles an hour. And watch also how low they go.
So, a crash, another one, a wild spin. It's car number 16. That's Tony Bettenhausen. Tony Bettenhausen Jr., son of a famous father. His brother Gary also in the race. They're one of the 4 sets of brothers in this race. The yellow flag out, of course, right away.
Tony, 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 Anthony.
My kid brother was born 1951, October 30th. Tony started racing stock cars down in Houston, Texas at Meyer Speedway. And he was driving for Gordon Van Leeuwen, who owned Vitafresh Orange Juice Company.
Whenever anyone at your house needs a break, make it an orange juice break.
He sponsored him, and he went and drove in NASCAR, it was called Late Model Sportsman, and he raced stock cars down there for several years.
The 17th row has Tony Bettenhausen in car number 24. And
Tony comes along, and Tony's a stock car driver, and he runs Daytona, and he's got Gordon Van Leeuwen funding him. And he said, I'm going to be like my brother. So he comes back and they build him a midget. And so Tony starts his USAC midget career, and he's hopeless. He's just awful.
yellow flag is out.
Yes, car number 16, Tony Bettenhausen, got up into the cushion just a little bit too far. Charlie and Spud, you'll watch the top of your screen here. You can see the car got into the loose stuff, broke loose, and spun with him.
My first year in midget racing in '75, he was my chief mechanic for a couple races. Tony was. And I remember we were getting ready to start my midget up. I said, how do I start this? He goes, how the fuck would I know? I drive stock cars. Oh, okay.
Row 1, Steve Lodshaw, Tony Bettenhausen.
He starts out in '76. So he sucked in a midget. They got him a sprint car, he was worse. I remember Tony and I we went to Winchester the same day. There was an inside lane at Winchester that you warmed up on, and that's where Tony ran the first hot lap session, and Vukovic is going nuts. Look at that schmuck, he's not even on the track, that fucking pussy's not even on the track yet. So Tony pulls in, and it was true, he'd never got up on the bank, and they're all over him, screaming at him. He was my buddy, so I tried to stand up for him. I said, Jesus Christ, this is his first time, and Gary said, shut up, you look like a pussy out there too. Okay, sorry.
One of the real stories here today has been Robin Miller in car number 40. Robin is a sports writer for the Indianapolis Star newspaper. I think not only were the fans here surprised at the good qualification run by Robin Miller, but Robin was also a little bit surprised at the great job that he did in qualifying here this afternoon. Robin Miller, car number 40.
So I was kind of the fourth Bettenhausen for a while. Those 5 years I had a Bettenhausen midget. Gary screamed at me and told me I was an idiot and didn't know anything about racing and what a moron, you shouldn't own a car. All the things which were true, incidentally. So it was tough love being in the Bettenhausen family. But Tony was really good indoor midget racing. Like at the Fairgrounds Coliseum, there'd be 75 cars and he'd be in the top 10. He won an indoor race in Louisiana, and I think it was because you had to be smooth, and Merle kept saying, listen, if we ever give him an Indy car, he'll be just fine because speed doesn't bother him and he'll have time. He just isn't good with this, but he'll have time. I said, an Indy car? The fucking guy can't make the fucking feature in Kokomo. Are you nuts?
A rookie, son of the three-time world champion. In row 6, number 16 is Tony Bettenhausen in his first ride at Indy. Number 15.
He gets an old hound in 1981, and him and Paul Diatlovich put it together, and he qualifies. And I was as happy for him as I would have been if I would have been. I was that happy for him because I knew what he'd been through.
Well, this is the battle on the racetrack. Pancho Carter and Tony Bettenhausen, the battle for the lead.
And then he probably wins Michigan if they don't screw him in scoring. And he's at Atlanta racing with Johnny Rutherford and Rick Mears at Atlanta going 200 miles an hour. And Bobby Grimm Jr. and I, who beat him like a drum every time we raced midgets with him, are standing in the infield going, are you kidding me? Tony Bettenhausen is racing for 4th place against Rick Mears and Johnny Rutherford. What is going on here? So Tony's turnaround was amazing, and then he started his own team.
I'm Tony Bettenhausen. GMC truck has been the official truck at the Indianapolis 500 for many years.
I mean, I guarantee you Dad picked on him for being a slow sprint midget driver. But once he got to Michigan, boy, he proved everybody wrong.
Tony was a great guy, wonderful personality. Didn't grow up under my dad's thumb because he was 10 years younger than Gary. Never had any major wins or anything, but was a great owner, operator. He was one of those owner mechanic drivers that just did a great job.
Oh, he was just fun. I mean, he was fun. He had a great personality. You know, we'd go up to Canada fishing. He had a cabin. Dad had a cabin about, I don't know, a quarter mile, a half a mile apart. And you know, Tony was just the life of the party. You know, he could keep everybody laughing, and he was just a pleasure to be around.
I'm glad the scene is so remote. To the best of my knowledge, the left engine was against this tree. The right engine was over here in this oil patch, and there's a hole in the ground over there, which might be where it was located. But as I'm standing about where the nose of the plane was and working my way aft, and all these ashes are of course the cabin area. And if we look, this is what we've been searching for. Okay. We think that's what we've been looking for, but we'll find out when we get back. Of course, right there, that dark area right in the center of my frame is where we found the ring.
he got a pilot's license probably about 1990 and had a 172 and used to fly around, had 1,800 hours.
You know, I flew with him probably 15 times in his old single-engine plane, and then he got a twin-engine Beech Baron, I think. But Tony wasn't a daredevil in a race car or an airplane. I think he just misread his map, and he flew into this ice storm.
It was on Valentine's Day, and he was flying over Lexington, Kentucky, with his wife and 2 business partners. Well, once they got ice, and he requested permission to go up above the ice, and as he went up, he got more ice, and the plane quit flying and went into a flat spin and just went down. I have the fortune or misfortune, and it's probably both, of standing next to my kid brother, Tony Bettenhausen, and his wife Shirley Ann McElreath Bettenhausen. And they both perished in an airplane crash on February 14th, 2000. And this is a cemetery I chose. I was the executor of Tony's estate, and I was a guardian of his children. They were 14 and 19 when they passed in the crash. And I had this signature on the will that said I was in charge of all this, but I didn't know anything or what to do, and kind of shot from the hip. And I just thought this would be the best place, west side, close to Indy. And by the way, there's 53 other race drivers that are buried here in Crown Hill. And so this will be, I don't know if they call this immortality, but or whatever, their final resting place. It's terrible to be here, but it's nice to have them in a nice place.
Saturday morning, Illinois State Fairgrounds in Springfield. The track is wet and sloppy for the Tony Bettenhausen 100. Instead of race cars, we get road graders. Scheduled to drive in the race, named after his legendary dad, who was killed practicing for the Indy 500 in 1961, is the Tinley Park Express, 42-year-old Gary Bettenhausen, Tony's eldest son. A 14-time Indy veteran himself, if given a choice, Gary would rather drive on dirt.
These are what I call real race cars, where the driver is still a little bit in control of how fast he's running and how well he does. I think in IndyCar, you're more or less at the mercy of how good your race car is.
Gary's car, sponsored by the Terre Haute First National Bank, is 9 years old. In design, it is very similar to what his dad raced at Indianapolis in the 50s. As the track dried, Gary got ready to take some practice laps. You'll notice he has limited use of his left arm, the result of a crash in 1974, but he continues to drive.
When I told Gary I was going to quit, and Gary said, "Don't ever change your mind," it's kind of the secret love that you have between each other. I mean, from the time I was old enough to remember racetracks, I worried about my dad getting hurt or killed in a race car. It's the way it is. And then the same thing happened when I had Gary, older, watching him, especially as competitive as he was, that he could get hurt or killed. Same thing with Tony. And even though you want somebody to do something in your family that comes from your heart. And if your heart and your mind tells you you want to drive race cars, you encourage them to drive race cars.
Out on the slippery track, Gary got a few hot laps under his belt, but there was a problem. The engine had developed a serious oil problem. He headed back to the pits. Then, an hour before the race was scheduled to start, the decision was made to change engines. Chief mechanic Robert Gallus and his crew worked feverishly, while Gary could only sit and think.
Well, you can't do anything about it. You have to take what comes. And what I'm doing right now is just trying to think about what gear to put in it and what tires to go with for the feature.
Seconds before the race began, from the pits, getting a push start from a tow truck, came Gary Bettenhausen. It was pure Hollywood, and the fans loved it. But it was not to be. He had second for a while, but Chuck Gertie and Dave Blaney finished in front of him. But Gary got an award anyway.
They just awarded you a trophy for most improved position.
Yeah. $125. That wants some breakfast for me.
That was a hell of a job driving. I mean, you know, from 30th to...
There's a lot more work starting back there.
Yeah.
Gotta eat a lot more dirt.
Yeah.
Gary Bettenhausen says he'll keep racing as long as he's got a chance to win. Then he'll quit, and as he puts it, get an honest job. Looks like he won't have to do that for a long while.
Most people go to work, they do their 8 hours, they get done, they go home. See, we're the lucky people in life. We know something, we do something that makes us feel like nothing else can make a man feel in his life. If you knew what the feeling was to win a race, to be the best on that particular night, and withstood the danger, the racing thing lives in your soul, and you just love it forever, and it's worth the risk because of the pleasure you personally feel, and that pleasure lasts forever.
The 1989 Holman Classic, and here is the lineup. Starting on the inside of row number 1, a two-time former champion of this division, Gary Bettenhausen. The two-time defending champion is on the outside. In row number 2, Jeff Gordon and Mark Alderson.
It's a great race. Very, very competitive race. Oh, Bettenhausen on fire. Fire is still going on, Gary. It's a fuel fire. Look, no, it's an oil fire. There's a lot of smoke out of it. He's unloading. He's up out of the car.
Gary Bettenhausen
He's out on the ground.
bails out, and the car continues to go on its own. It's coming to a stop.
Well, this is Gary Bettenhausen, one of Gary's twin sons. Give us an update first on your dad's condition.
Well, I was down there at the area where he stopped and got out of the car, and he appears to have second-degree burns on the inside of both of his thighs.
Now, you told me they're going to fly him to Methodist Hospital to treat those burns?
Yes, I guess just because of the pain involved. They want to get him down there and treat him for the pain as soon as possible.
Now tell us what you have ascertained actually happened.
Well, we're not sure, but since we haven't seen the car yet, but apparently the drive shaft let go, and our fuel pump is mounted off the back of the camshaft right above the drive shaft between the driver's knees, and apparently when the drive shaft let go, it took the fuel pump with it.
Well, of course, those of us that have followed Gary Bettenhausen's career know it's been laced with great talent, but also some very terrible luck. A very scary situation here at Raceway Park this evening.
That was my 15 minutes of fame. I was interviewed live on TV for that. Some things some people that may not know about that. And Todd, feel free to jump in if I get anything wrong here, but Dad had an engagement at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and this was, of course, he was running for John Menard at the time, and I believe Dad had some sort of a photo shoot or something to do earlier in the day.
He had taken pictures, and he just had the outer part of his uniform on. He didn't have the long underwear on.
He didn't put his fireproof underwear on, and second or third lap of the feature, crankshaft broke at the rear main, and just cleaned everything off the motor plate. And he was basically in a fireball going down the front straightaway. Jumped up out of the car, up on top of the cage. And one of the things that people don't know also, when he tumbled off the top of the car, we had a set of headers on that car that actually came, I believe, off of a stock block V8 Indy car with some modifications. And instead of the headers coming out of the exhaust ports and going straight down toward the ground, the headers pointed out toward the side of the car. And he landed on the headers, or he probably would have gotten run over by the left rear tire.
Well, he got some pretty serious second-degree burns on the inside of his legs. I think it was getting warm in a place where he decided he better get out of the car quick.
He was only in the hospital for a couple days, and ended up telling the hospital personnel, "You can either release me or not. Either way, I'm gone."
And then he went to DuQuoin the following week and ran 7th, racing Kenny Irwin Jr. and Tony Stewart right up to the end of the race. All burned up, all bandaged up. Couldn't keep him out of a race car. Oh yeah, Tim Delrose donated this to the museum This is one of Dad's Silver Crown suits when he was driving the Grant King car.
That would have been like circa 1981 through 80.
He won
6 or 7.
He won the national championship in 80 and 83. And those patches, I guarantee you my mom sewed them on by hand. So there's Dad's suit. Yeah, Dad wasn't much for memorabilia. It was different back then. But I've got a couple things here that I brought in. This was the last helmet that he wore, 1996 US 500. And there's a great story to that helmet because I never asked Dad for anything. And he never formally retired, you know, he just kind of slipped away, which is how he wanted it. And I asked him after it became clear that he wasn't going to drive anymore, I said, hey, that last helmet, you know, could I have it? And he's like, oh, sure. And didn't think anything of it for a couple years. And then I asked him, you know, hey, can I have that helmet? And he kind of got this look on his face like, uh-oh. I said, what happened to it? He said, I loaned my snowmobile to the Monrovia Fire Department and the helmet went with it. I said, get that helmet back. So he did. So there's his last helmet. And this one has a great story. This was in the car that Dad almost won the 500 with in 1972. Because Jim Travers, the engine builder, who was half of Traco Engineering, when he tore the engine down, he hung this on his back porch in Utah. And it hung there for 45 years. And after he passed away, his entire estate was bequeathed to an animal shelter where he volunteered. Anyway, the executor of the estate got this piston to us. So this is probably actually the property of Mr. Penske, but here it is.
Yeah, and he said he hung it on his porch as a reminder just how difficult it is to win Indy. Indy doesn't discriminate. Sometimes the lucky guy, sometimes you're not. But it wasn't I don't think it was a selfish thing. I think it was more for the family, not for the individual. Just like Merle said when it came to the first one.
I think I remember when I first started it, we all had it in our mind that we'd win the first one for Tony and then the second ones would be for ourselves. So it was just something that we wanted to do for him.
The most important thing in my dad's life was winning in Indianapolis. And he never did, and he ended up dying there. And it went on to me, and it's my most important thing in my life. I think without a doubt we've given too much, and it's almost too late to quit now. I mean, you've got to keep going for what we've been trying to do for so many years. You know, what does this family have to do to realize that there's a better way than automobile racing?
The most gut-wrenching interview I think I've ever seen before the Indianapolis 500 was Gary Bettenhausen as he was at the end of his career, because his boys just have situations that weren't going to allow them to race. And Gary was sitting on this deck saying how badly he wanted to win the Indianapolis 500. His boys couldn't race. You know, Tony had girls, and he said, and he started to cry. He says, I'm running out of time. I'm going to cry thinking about it.
We're running out of time. I realize that I'm in the twilight of my career. There's Tony, and that's it. Tony doesn't have any boys. My two boys will never drive. So we're running out of time.
They worked hard enough. They paid their dues. You know, they got hurt, they came back. They got hurt, they came back. I mean, when spring rolled around, it was, you know, here comes Indy again.
Today, May 28, 1989, it's the greatest spectacle in racing, the 73rd running of the Indianapolis 500-mile race.
Yeah, in 1989, we had a Lola with a Buick V6 in it, and the car actually was an ex-Pat Patrick Marlboro Lola from Emerson Fittipaldi, and it sat in our garage the winter before we actually started working on it. And Mom's car sat outside, and here's an Indy car, you know, in the family garage. And then
Not the race shop, it was in the garage adjacent to the house.
Right.
For the latter stages of his career, he only raced one time a year, you know, which was at Indy. And I think we probably all know by now that that's not the way to win Indy. You have to be competing, you know, on the IndyCar circuit year round, and it has to be a well-oiled machine. I don't think the most skilled driver could go there without having that total package and having, you know, a team that's really sharp.
Every pit stop has to be perfect or you end up in the back of the line.
Exactly.
Gary Bettenhausen, will the dream come true today? He now begins to move toward his race car, supported by his brother Merle. The rest of the family begins, along with the crew, to gather close to give some moral support. As they walk past Peter DePaulo's Duesenberg and out into the pit area. It's now just 18 minutes to the start of the engines. We'll be back. And the green flag flies, and we're racing at Indianapolis as the front row heads for the first turn, side by side, and Emerson Fittipaldi sweeps from the outside across the front of Rick Mears and Al Unser. The Indianapolis 500, the 73rd running, is underway. Emerson Fittipaldi is leading. Aerial bombs fire off overhead, indicating the position of the cars on the track, as Fittipaldi already up into the third turn, and Emerson Fittipaldi coming across the short chute and streaming toward the start-finish line. Now the fight begins for third as Al Unser tries to hold off a charging Mario Andretti. The fight is for third place. Brian Hammonds, there is, of course, some concern about this car. The 99 machine that belongs to Gary Bettenhausen. The crew went out onto the straightaway and retrieved it. They have quite a push to get it back to his actual pit area where they can first apply the tools to it and start to get it in performing order and hopefully into this field.
See Gary Bettenhausen now being pushed back into the garage. He had started from the middle of the fifth row, his best opportunity for years. That Bettenhausen obsession, that long-time saga, continues, certainly without a resolution today.
Jerry, it's a very quiet gasoline alley for Gary Bettenhausen. Gary, this was supposed to be your year, and you're out. What happened?
We don't know. Something, I think the cam broke or something. Was just first gear warming up, and all of a sudden the engine went pop bang and quit running. And
your feelings, though, you know, you really had pointed towards this one and felt that this was the best shot you've had since probably mid-1970. How do you feel now?
Truthfully, I can't say it on air. Disappointed, you know. I really felt I had a chance to run right up in the front today, and with a little luck, maybe even win the race, because it's a 220-mile-an-hour race car.
You said it before when we did the story on the Bettenhausens. You don't know how many more years this family can give to this place. Any thoughts now about that?
I have to start counting days again. Seems like a long time till next year.
I guess we all kind of took it for granted back in the early 70s. Dad was such a hot prospect and had so much talent and came so close to winning the race early in his career that when 72 didn't happen, we all thought it was just going to be a matter of time before another Bettenhausen ended up winning. The family thought maybe there was a score to settle with Indy.
A man of constant sorrow, seen trouble all my days.
He called me at noon for one of the tractors or the combine or something, and that was noon, and 10 minutes after 2, Jack Beckley called me, and he was gone.
He's out of the race now. A guy who wants to win Indianapolis more than anyone I know. One race his father wanted to win and never won, and the Bettenhausen family keeps searching for that victory at Indy.
A man with constant sorrow. I've seen
Ken, I've got a disappointed Gary Bettenhausen with me. Gary, you stopped quickly for an oil leak, I understand, early in the going. What finally put you out?
Well, the same old four-cylinder story.
You'll notice he has limited use of his left arm, the result of a crash in 1974, but he continues to drive.
Of course, those of us that have followed Gary Bettenhausen's career know it's been laced with great talent, but also some very terrible luck.
I goofed myself up once before. Those cards on the wall make it a lot easier. It's just a great feeling.
But there was a problem. The engine had developed a serious oil problem. He headed back to the pits.
A man of constant sorrow.
I'll never forget this. We had a group of high school kids come out to Indianapolis Raceway Park. Mike Lewis, who was the general manager. It was kind of an educational day. It was really kind of interesting. And he had a panel of drivers who could take questions from kids that were in the grandstands. And somebody asked Larry Rice, you know, the great Larry Rice, who was your favorite race driver coming up? And he said, I would tell you that my favorite race driver was Gary Bettenhausen. I didn't think that he had necessarily innate born talent, but he had the desire and drive to be a great race driver.
Well, Gary, you've had a few laps out there. How's it feel? Well, the car feels real good, Larry. We had a little problem with the fuel system. Was plumbed wrong, and we were about 700-800 RPM short from what we should have been. But the chassis is working good, and that's the main thing, so it doesn't wear this old man out. But how does it feel to you? Is it like riding a horse? Oh, yeah. You know, I hadn't been in a racetrack or in a race car since, let's see, a year ago last October. And about 3 laps, I was right at home again. Right, good luck. Well, thank you, and I just want to tell you, keep your suit and your helmet handy in case I get tired.
Gary Bettenhausen, yeah, I mean, we know he set records at the Speedway. We know he could have won. We know the sort of tragic story about his accident and the loss of use of his arm. What could have been with Roger Penske? What could have been in victories? Is it an American racing tragedy? To some degree it is. Greatness is not just bestowed on those who win the major races. It's the fight you carried in that mattered the most.
From Monrovia, Indiana, Gary with the 1991 Lola with Buick Power, turning in the fastest lap in qualifying today at 224.843, his 4-lap average.
This man has been beaming all month. He is the fastest man in the field with Buick V6 power. Gary Bettenhausen, who has such a long, historic relationship with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. This has been your month, Gary.
Yes, Jack, you said I was the fastest driver in the field. I think I'm just driving the fastest car in the field.
It was an amazing experience just because Dad was so late in his career. To be able to, beat Penske and all the other top teams, at least for 4 laps is something that goes in the record books. It's something that'll be there forever. His fierce determination, probably the thing that most people remember him by, and certainly the thing that I carry with me. I remember one time before hot laps, a person that didn't know us, he pointed to Dad's car and he said, I come here every year to watch that guy and that car go through that turn. He was talking about Dad. That's really cool. I think he'll be remembered for how he treated the fans. He met his son, signed autographs. There's thousands of people out there with memories like that, and that's really what he left behind.
Gary Bettenhausen himself, a veteran of 21 races at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Gary was racing that trophy dash his whole life. In 2014, his heart stopped one Sunday afternoon.
He wouldn't have done it any other way. He did everything his way, even when he checked out.
No one likes tragedy. It just breaks your heart because they become your heroes. A person like me, I'm for sure heartbroken that he didn't win. But I think a lot of people don't remember all the races that he did win.
You know, we didn't win Indy, but we sure won a lot of other ones, and every one of them felt great. You know, maybe another one of us will make it there someday, but for me, you know, racing it's more about family and the friendships that are made along the way, you know, than it is about success.
I think what it means to me right now is making sure that I raise the two best kids I can.
Yeah, raise the car, Ellie.
Good move.
I see him. Boom. Boom.
There you go.
First place, boy.
You know, teach him all the stuff that Dad taught me to do and some of the stuff that I learned not to do.
And you can see the smoke keeps getting higher and higher. Then they put the red flag out and stop the race. About 10 minutes after this picture was taken, a guy comes up and he goes, "So you're going to race again with one arm?" I said, "Yeah." He looked at me and goes, "You didn't lose your arm, you lost your mind."
Now that Tony's gone and Dad's gone, you know, it's Merle. Merle tells me things that I didn't know back in the day. And look at you, how many years later? We're pretty close to him.
That was at Winchester.
They should have won the Indianapolis 500 by all due rights, and they did it. But those guys gave it their all at all times. And is that a tragedy? No, that's to be admired. They went out with their guns blazing, and I like that.
We were young and we loved life and lived life the way you're supposed to. And all I can say is that don't ever give up and keep moving forward.
Heartaches, heartbreaks, heartbroken over a love you couldn't win. Had you ever thought of starting over? Starting from the bottom again.
Okay, so let's bring in Robin Miller now from Cleveland and Paul Tracy. This is a guy that Sebastian Bourdais actually called washed up.
Well, I think when you're close to 40, you haven't won a race in a couple years, Nicole. If anybody needed a victory, get the fuck off the racetrack, you stupid son of a bitch. I think we have to start again. Sorry about that, Greggy.
That was absolutely classic. We're only on the bird. It's okay.
Sorry.